Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. She Sat There Like All Ordinary Ones is a Mandarin language coming-of-age film focusing on the lives of two teenagers in their final years of high school. The studious, if socially awkward, Zhuang and the reserved Meng. The pair are brought together when Zhuang witnesses Meng firing a starting pistol and decides to take the blame for the theft of the equipment in an effort to get closer to her and win her affections, and so he decides to join her track team. This debut feature from Chinese director Hu Chia-chu sidesteps the saccharine pitfalls of the teen coming-of-age drama to really bring to the screen a tender, introspective, and visually distinct portrait of two teenagers struggling with fitting in and the realities of adulthood that lie just over the horizon. Okay, so just as an overview, some of the key themes and ideas that are explored within She Sat There, things like coming of age, friendship, family and school pressures, this idea of finding a sense of purpose or finding a sense of belonging, ideas of independence and conformity, learning from failure or reconciling the past, to communication and compassion and empathy. They're all things that are explored within the film, and I'll touch on some of these in more detail as I go along through the presentation. Now, one of the approaches I often like to take when introducing a film text is to start from the big picture and then gradually work in towards the detailed filmic or scenic analysis. And one of the reasons I like to do that is to really impress upon students this idea that art and film isn't created in a vacuum. Cinema responds to its cultural and historical moment, whether quite deliberately or intentionally or unconsciously. And so placing a film within its various contexts often allows students to have a greater understanding of the text on a deeper level before you move into that close analysis of scenes and sequences. And this film explores a range of social, cultural, and familial pressures, many of them associated with this idea of the coming of age. Things like mental health or romance or the pressure to succeed in that transition to adulthood and in the specific setting of contemporary China, or Nantong, where the film is filmed. So again, geographic context, looking at the specific region or area of Nantong. How does having an understanding of that particular region shape our understanding of the characters and the world that they live in? Or to things like school. There's reference made to the college entrance exams. If students aren't familiar with those, then that would provide another avenue of context through which to enhance students' understanding of the characters and what they're going through, and the pressures on them as well. So also issues to do with mental health and education within that context of China. And also divorce. Both of the lead characters come from divorced families. So how does, say, the social stigmas surrounding divorce or the implications surrounding divorce in China differ from, say, Australia or other countries? How has divorce as a cultural or social phenomenon changed and the perceptions around it changed within, say, China in recent times? Another context that I think would be worthwhile in terms of approaching this film would be through its production background. And here I think interviews with the director might really enhance students' understanding of not just the creative process for the film, but also the creative intentions behind the film. And look, I always say this with a bit of a disclaimer that a writer or a director's intentions for a particular film aren't the only way of understanding or interpreting that particular film, but it does provide, I guess, a springboard for discussion, certainly within a classroom context, or to questions about, did students feel the director achieved their intentions? Did that come across in their experience of the film? And if not, well, why? Or how does having an awareness or an understanding of the director's intentions change our understanding of the film? Does it provide a new perspective that we hadn't necessarily considered at the time? And there's a really wonderful interview with the director, Hu Chiao-Chu, on the Berlinale website, and I've listed the link to that there. I'm going to refer to this interview at a couple of stages throughout this presentation. But I think this is an interesting quote or excerpt from that interview, which provides a sort of a good way of framing the film in terms of the director's intentions. And he says, "Youth is a romantic description of the process of growing into adulthood. Behind the simplicity and beauty, sometimes there is also a self-centeredness, irresponsibility, and a monotonous understanding of the world. Only after many years did I become aware of all the luck I once had as a teenager. Looking back, I felt ashamed for the carefree days when ignorance was true bliss. This story tells about a sloppy boy observing a stubborn girl. He sincerely hopes to help the other one who seems struggling, but in the end, it turns out to be his wishful thinking. He eventually fails and realizes that every idea he holds is evolving, though it is still precious to question and be questioned. Understanding others is a way to know oneself." There's plenty of stuff in that quote and in the interview more broadly to unpack. But even just in that last line, understanding others is a way to know oneself. That's an ideal prompt for discussion in terms of analysis. Another context through which you could analyse and discuss this film is through the lens of genre, as a coming-of-age film. So, She Sat There could be approached through either the genre of the coming-of-age teen film or to broader narratives dealing with family conflicts from a teenage perspective. These are films or TV shows that typically depict a key transitional moment within teenhood. And here you could ask students to consider, what films or TV shows that they're familiar with or that they've watched that deal with a coming of age. What are some points of connection between this film and those other coming of age narratives? Really trying to connect their experience of this film to other narratives that they might be familiar with, teasing out maybe points of similarity and difference in terms of tropes or themes or the way in which different cultures perhaps approach these ideas. So what might be some other films or TV shows dealing with teenagers, of mental health, of family conflict? What alternative insights or approaches have been taken in those films as opposed to She Sat There? Some similar or relevant films that this film brought to mind, a film that was on the MIFF Schools program from last year, Deep Sea, an animated feature, but it sort of touches on issues of divorce and coming of age. So again, there are some key points of connection there. And then two films that I realise are worlds apart in terms of their cultural origins. The Year My Voice Broke, the Australian film, and Say Anything, the American film, both from the late 80s. But both of those films have that awkward, almost unrequited relationship or crush element within the narrative, and both wedded to coming-of-age narratives. Either of those texts might provide ample opportunity for points of comparison if you're looking for something in a different cultural context. Okay, so moving on to the nuts and bolts of film analysis, getting back to those techniques and the terminology that I mentioned at the beginning. So really, students should be able to ideally recognize and identify some of these basic techniques, whether it's the close-up and why a close-up might be used, in this case, to provide a sort of an intimate connection between the audience and the character on screen, perhaps their emotional state in that particular moment, or a wide-angle shot, which is typically used to provide a wider context, the world or the setting in which these characters live, or suggest a sort of relationship between the characters and the world in which they live. And this particular wide-angle shot is interesting in terms of the way it shows both Zhuang and Meng in this setting together, but sort of dwarfed by this train that's passing over the top of them on this bridge, and the sound that drowns out this moment of connection between the two of them. So in a way, the use of that wide-angle shot at that particular moment really inflects our understanding or our connection to those characters and their connection to each other, because we're suddenly being pushed at a distance, at a remove from this moment. But also the way in which characters are filmed, whether it's a high-angle or a low-angle shot. Typically, when a director uses a high-angle shot looking down at a character, it tends to diminish their status on screen, whereas low-angle shots, camera looking up at a subject, tends to exaggerate their power or their status on screen. It implies certain power relationships between certain characters. Now, you could argue, or you could put it back to students, is that what these particular techniques are being used for in this context, or in the context of these two scenes? And this is where I think it's really crucial that students have the ability to identify the technique, have an understanding of its general function, but also have a flexibility in their analysis, that they can adapt that interpretation to the particulars of the scene or sequence or the narrative more broadly. Because I think you could argue that maybe the use of the high angle shot or the use of the low angle shot in that particular moment is perhaps not being used in those traditional ways. And again, this is part of the film analysis and discussion. So other techniques that we see throughout the film, composition and framing is obviously key, especially in terms of the relationship between Zhuang and Meng. We rarely get two shots, so the two of them within the frame at one time. The director frequently isolates them within a kind of shot reverse shot editing structure, like we see here in the upper left two images. And that, again, and students should be mindful of this, or you could put this to students, why is that the case? Is it to emphasize the disconnect, emotional disconnect between the characters? Or say in those lower two images, where we have the characters again separated by geography and separated within the frame, but the director's using a sort of symmetry in terms of the editing, cutting from one to the other on this phone call between the two of them. That they're going through something similar, but they're also, in a way, worlds apart. These are all things to consider in terms of the visual representation of characters and how that provides the audience with an understanding of those characters, their relationships to one another. Other techniques to be mindful of, the use of camera focus, where the character in the deep background is out of focus and Meng in the foreground is in focus. Why is that? We get these transitions in the editing between scenes and sequences of these red flourishes. And I'm going to come back to the significance of red as a motif or a symbol within the film a little bit later on. But again, why might the filmmaker be using this technique to transition between key scenes? The use of costuming is also, I think, an important one to be mindful of, and how the colour palette associated with the characters seems to almost switch at a key point within the film, where initially Zhuang appears to be associated with red and Meng with blue, and then later on with the film we start to see these nods to Zhuang in blue and Meng in red. Does that signal to the audience a change in their characters? And to be mindful of changes within the formal presentation of the image, such as through surveillance cameras, and what that might suggest about either cultural or social elements, or indeed just broader themes of, say, surveillance. And in a way, this leads us to the concept of mise-en-scène, which is really crucial from a film analysis standpoint. And it basically refers to all of the various elements that go within a scene or a sequence and how they contribute meaning or understanding for the audience. So things like lighting, composition, production elements such as the use of props or costumes, all of those elements working together to convey a scene to the audience. How does that shape our understanding of themes or character through that visual design? And so here you could ask students to consider how are various spaces within the film contrasted at this visual level, and how do those differences reflect differences between characters. And here we have two perfect examples of the use of contrasting mise-en-scène to represent contrasting characters. So Zhuang's room, sort of the typical chaotic teenage bedroom, very much expresses elements of his personality through the images and the posters on the walls and the props and so on. And how might that contrast to, say, Meng's apartment? It's very sterile. The use of blues and purples and muted colours there. The coldness of that space contrasted with the warmth of Zhuang's space. So these are things that we might not be aware of as we're watching it, but they certainly shape our understanding of character. And that's what really in that post-screening analysis, you want students to be able to reflect upon and tie the visual language of cinema back to how it creates meaning, how it creates an understanding of character. The use of music and sound is another prominent aspect that we see throughout the film, both in terms of the film's soundtrack and also in relation to the various characters. and the theme. So, for instance, the sound of the starting pistol. And you could ask students, what is Zhuang's connection to music? And how does it serve as a means of him connecting with Meng? How are music and sound linked to other themes, such as listening or communication? And here we have a shot of Zhuang and Meng bonding, perhaps. But again, notice the way in which that's presented visually. Not only through the presence of the red light contrasted with the blue in that scene as well. We begin with Zhuang with one earpiece in, we come down past the lyrics of the music, and we finish on Meng. Again, there's a sort of implied connection through the music to both of them, but in a way they're still separated. They're still in their own worlds. Again, it's a really fascinating scene to analyze in terms of not just its use of music and color, but also how it connects to what these characters are going through in their coming of age. And there are broader references to music and to listening elsewhere in the film as well. So in terms of setting, the focus on school is really key. So how does this film depict the students' educational experience? The pressures on students and their families. How might that contrast to the students' experience of education from an Australian perspective? It's established very early on within the film, the motto established by the teacher: study hard, live better. We see a teacher slap Zhuang on the back of the head at one point, admonishing him for trying to help out a fellow student, something that, again, becomes a drumbeat throughout the film in terms of education and just how competitive this environment is. We hear the teacher say at another point, hang out with bad students, enough to become one. The film raises a number of these issues through the microcosm of the classroom in relation to economic pressures and the need to get a scholarship, or the pressure from parents. Zhuang's mother says to him at one point, you wouldn't succeed in academics or athletics. It's also interesting to come back to this motto of study hard, live better at the end of the film, or towards the end of the film, where we get the inverse: study better, live hard. I think students could consider both of those mottos and how they differ. And again, you could bring this back to the director's intentions. Does that come through in the experience of watching this film? That sense of the uncanny or the unfamiliar, a sense of the director's viewpoint of coming back to education from an adult perspective, filtered through the adolescent viewpoints of his main characters. So the theme of finding one's place, as I mentioned earlier, again, is at the forefront of this film. How does the filmmaker represent this idea of both Zhuang and Meng as outsiders, incompatible with their surroundings, or ill at ease in the spaces that they inhabit? What's the significance of the film's title? She sat there like all ordinary ones. But coming back to the visual presentation, the language of cinema, if you look at those two images on the left, the way that Zhuang and Meng are both introduced fairly early on within the film in relation to their classmates, they're not centrally framed. They're in focus, but they're either standing out from the crowd like Zhuang, or they're hidden and obscure, almost disappearing into that massive conformity like we have with Meng. Or the world is kind of closed in on them. Those images on the right-hand side, again, through that bluish tone that we see at key moments of both Zhuang in the classroom framed through the window, or on the other side with Meng. And again, this excerpt from that interview I mentioned earlier with Chu. Lots in there to unpack and connect back to the cultural context and traditions within the film. So one of the key motifs that I mentioned earlier, the red plastic bag, and red more generally, becomes a real dominant visual motif. So what's the significance of the red plastic bag to Zhuang, or to other ideas presented within the film? As his father tells him at one point, just go with the flow, like the floating bag. What levels of cultural symbolism are attached to the colour red? It might be interesting to get students' perspectives on this, and then to see how they respond to, say, what the director intended through this particular motif that we see throughout the film, where he says, the red plastic bag, one of the most common daily necessities in China, was once free of charge. It exists in various street vendors lying on the side of the road after usage, flying in the air, and finally becomes a piece of memory. Just like the concept of youth in Chinese language films, it refers to the young and the beautiful. It's looking back into the past and is usually a representation to contrast adulthood. There are always two sides to the same thing. Behind the romantic ignorance is a narrow vision which doesn't allow for true empathy. This could be something to put to students and see how that shapes their perceptions or their understandings of the motif. So to the starting pistol. The starting pistol is the other dominant motif within the film. It's the object that brings Zhuang and Meng together towards the start of the film. So what is its particular connection for Meng? Is there a violence associated with the object or in and through its sound? What associations are conjured by the starting pistol in relation to, say, the other themes of the film, such as the pressure to compete and to succeed? Does the meaning of the starting pistol change over the course of the narrative? So again, a number of questions to consider. But again, the director Chu elaborates on this in that interview. Other motifs that you could look at in terms of the film and its ideas and its themes and its character: the motif of mirrors that we see throughout, the motif of flowers, or to gestures like the one we have referenced there with Meng's mum touching her face, or to these ideas of compassion or empathy. How are these references all connected or explored within the film? In terms of language or a broader cultural study, the film references a number of cultural elements and traditions that could certainly be discussed in more detail as part of that further study. So references to things like the Mid-Autumn Festival, to the fireworks that are associated with that festival, to cultural works or texts like the Lanting Zhu, or to the Forbidden City, to these ideas of yin and yang, to eating and customs related to food, or to marriage. And again, we get these references to both marriage and to divorce within the film. So there is a wide scope here to use this film as a prompt for broader cultural analysis and discussion. And so without giving too much away, students should really also consider the creative choices regarding the ending and the concluding images of the film. What impression might the director be attempting to leave us with? What does the ending suggest about these two characters and their futures? Does the ending offer a resolution to the issues that they've had to confront? Or is it more ambiguous, more open-ended? Again, the film is dedicated at the end of the credits to those I never had the patience to understand. What might the director have meant by that dedication? And again, I would strongly encourage a variety of interpretations from the students in relation to the ending. And in terms of wrapping all of these elements up, an assessment that could be set, which I know has been particularly popular in language courses, would be to have students read and critically engage with published reviews of the film and then respond by writing their own, whether in Mandarin or in English, drawing on that close analysis of the film and then utilizing some of the terminology that I've been outlining. Because this film is still relatively new, it's only really just started screening in festivals at the time of recording, there aren't a lot of professionally written reviews of the film yet. However, I did find this one on Letterboxd, which I thought was interesting, where Mitzi, or MITC, writes, "She Sat There Like All Ordinary Ones is a successful, reflective youth film with a certain poetic beauty. The film is modern, formally dressed in a 2010s lo-fi aesthetic, a little too young, adult, melodramatic, but there's no doubt that there is a lot of colour, a clear attention to expressive close-ups, assorted arrangements, character-intensive dramaturgy, and a partly vague but sincere, thoughtful, and effectively philosophising dialogue. The whole piano and violin background, again, gave me a few emotions. That's just how I'm made. But actually this lovely, appropriately realistic film is largely a stimulating success." Now, you may have gathered that was translated from the German, but you could provide students with any number of reviews to give them a sense of what's expected in terms of structuring their response within this particular assessment task. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.